Jane Winslow had never considered herself a particularly reactive person. She was rational by nature, patient by necessity, and calculated by profession. For the past 12 years, she'd worked as a regional auditor for a large transportation company based in Illinois, spending long hours poring over logistics discrepancies, reconciling cross-state inventories, and diffusing corporate tensions with her calm, unflappable demeanor. It was a skill set honed through years of navigating quietly through bureaucracies and numbers, never drawing attention, never stepping too far in any direction. Quiet was her currency, and control, her peace. That's precisely why she chose that house. 3 bedrooms, a modest brick facade, and a fenced backyard shaded by a pair of mature oaks, located in a small, well-manicured community just outside the city limits. It wasn't grand or particularly modern, but it felt like order. Safe. Predictable. After a divorce that drained more than her savings and a few years in a downtown apartment surrounded by noise and anonymity, Jane craved silence she could own. The first week in the new house felt like a sigh of relief after years of tension. She worked from home most days, her company allowing flexible hours since the pandemic had shifted much of their operations online. Her mornings began with quiet coffee on the porch and ended with long walks through the neighborhood with Luna, her 5-year-old border collie, the only living creature she truly trusted anymore. Luna had seen her through the worst of the divorce, the nights Jane couldn't sleep, the days she felt like she had disappeared inside her own life. The dog was intelligent, loyal, and incredibly well-behaved, a reflection Jane often thought of the time and effort she'd poured into training her. Neighbors waved in passing those first days, offering polite smiles but not much more. She didn't mind. She wasn't there to make friends. She just wanted to live undisturbed. Still, it wasn't long before she noticed the woman next door, perfectly styled gray-blonde hair, pressed khakis, and that peculiar expression of thin-lipped courtesy that felt more judgmental than welcoming. Karen Ashton. Jane learned her name when she received a carefully folded pamphlet slipped into her mailbox labeled Neighborhood Values and Expectations, with a note in blue ink, from one homeowner to another. Karen. There was no official letterhead, no seal, no indication of any formal governance. It was just a list. Noise expectations, lawn care reminders, preferred trash collection times, passive-aggressive nonsense. Jane almost laughed. She tossed it in the drawer under her sink and forgot about it. Until she didn't. It began subtly. Comments through the hedge. Jane would be outside brushing Luna, and Karen's voice would float across the shrubs like a smog. She's quite vocal for a border collie. Or, some of us meditate in the mornings, dear, just so you know. Jane smiled politely and said nothing. Not wanting to escalate a petty annoyance. But it wasn't long before that irritation matured into something more concrete. A week after the second hedge remark, Jane received a letter in her mailbox. It wasn't from the city, nor from any recognizable entity. Just a folded sheet in an unmarked envelope, typed and unsigned. It read, "There have been complaints about your dog's incessant barking. Please be considerate of your neighbors. Further disturbances will result in formal action." No citation, no return address, just a threat wrapped in suggestion. Jane stared at it for a long time, then set it on her kitchen counter and stared at Luna. The dog looked back at her, wagging her tail slightly, confused. The truth was simple. Luna didn't bark, at least not habitually. She might give a sharp woof when someone approached the front door or bark in excitement when Jane came home after errands, but she wasn't the kind of dog to stand in the yard and vocalize for hours. Jane knew this. Her dog slept at the foot of her bed each night and spent most of her days curled up in the sun by the back window. If there had been any prolonged noise, Jane would have heard it. This complaint wasn't based in truth. It was personal. She felt it in her bones, the way women like Karen Ashton operated. Not with honesty, but with veiled attacks and performative civility. Still, Jane gave her the benefit of the doubt, chalking it up to a misunderstanding or misattributed noise. Maybe someone else's dog had been the culprit. Maybe Karen was just overly sensitive. The second letter arrived 5 days later, this time with an official tone. Ongoing violations of local residential noise ordinances are being documented. If disturbances persist, you may be subject to fines and/or further action. No name, no contact, just implication. Jane began to feel her stomach knot every time she checked the mailbox. The tranquility she had moved here for was now tinged with dread, the kind of creeping anxiety that arrives when something unjust begins to edge into your daily life. She started adjusting her routine, walking Luna later in the evening, timing her outings to avoid passing Karen's house, minimizing outdoor time altogether. The fence now felt less like protection and more like a thin border between civility and Cold War. One evening, Jane heard the unmistakable sound of someone rapping against her fence. 3 hard knocks, followed by silence. She ran outside, but no one was there. A minute later, Luna barked once. The next morning, there was a fresh letter in the box. That was the moment it became clear. This wasn't about a dog. This was about territory, control. Jane's presence, her independence, her mere existence on the block was apparently enough to provoke territorial response from someone who saw herself as gatekeeper of the community. It wasn't loud parties or drunken friends or late-night music. It was a woman, alone, with a dog, refusing to be deferential. And Karen couldn't stand it. The injustice of it all began to wear on Jane, but what truly infuriated her was the helplessness. There was no proper forum to refute the claims, no one to call, just letters. She documented everything, recorded her own dog's behavior, took videos of quiet evenings, but she knew that wouldn't matter. People like Karen didn't play fair, and they didn't respond to reason. They created problems, then accused you of overreacting. Their weapons were plausible deniability and righteous indignation. One night, Jane lay in bed, unable to sleep, the latest warning letter burning in her mind. Luna was curled at her feet, breathing softly, and the silence in the room was almost mocking. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, and then rose, walking barefoot through the house in the dark. In the hallway closet, behind old moving boxes, was a speaker system she hadn't unpacked. A big, heavy, subwoofer-based thing she'd bought for her old apartment to drown out traffic noise. An idea began to form. Not born from pettiness, but from something deeper. A desire to reclaim space. Not by shouting, not by writing counter-letters, but with a mirror. A reflection. If Karen wanted to weaponize sound, then Jane would give her sound. Not from Luna, but from a speaker. Controlled. Timed. Legally non-actionable and unmistakably deliberate. That was the night Jane decided she wouldn't just sit back and tolerate quiet war. She would answer it, with precision, timing, and a calm that would leave no room for escalation. Just accountability. And the first note of resistance would come not in the form of a letter, but as the crisp, intentional bark of Luna, played through a speaker at exactly 2 a.m. on a quiet, otherwise peaceful street. It started with the speaker, tucked discreetly into the corner of the yard behind the cedar planter box. Jane had mounted it just beneath the edge of the shed's eave, hidden in shadow, angled carefully toward the property line. It wasn't loud enough to shake windows or wake the neighborhood. She didn't want chaos. She wanted focus. The sound file had taken her longer to edit than she expected. It couldn't be too long, or it would be deemed malicious. It couldn't loop endlessly, or it might violate local noise statutes. It had to be brief, sharp, unmistakable. She settled on a 30-second clip. A few medium barks, spaced unnaturally even, digitally pitched down ever so slightly to sound deeper, more primal. It wasn't Luna's bark exactly. It was Luna reimagined, sculpted from real recordings Jane had captured during playtime. She played the clip back several times through her laptop to make sure it had the right balance of realism and artificiality. This was important. If Karen wanted to report barking, Jane would deliver it on command. She scheduled it for 2 a.m., using a timer with a silent startup. The first time, she stayed up just to be sure it worked. In the middle of the night, with the house still and her heart oddly calm, the speaker activated. The bark echoed once, twice, then a third time, firm but not exaggerated, perfectly timed. Luna didn't even stir. She was used to hearing her own voice and remained curled beneath the window. Jane waited. She stood by the hallway corner listening for movement next door, a light switch, the creak of a door opening. Nothing. The neighborhood remained motionless, consumed in the artificial bark and the silence that followed it. The speaker clicked off. Jane returned to bed with a strange satisfaction pressing against her chest. Not pride, not victory, but the rare peace of being the one to draw the line first. The next morning, she found no note, no email, nothing on her porch or in her mailbox. But the day after that, the first knock came. Not on the door, but against her fence. A series of 3 hard raps at exactly 6:15 a.m., just as Jane was pouring coffee. She didn't respond. Luna growled lowly from her usual spot by the glass door, but Jane placed her hand gently on the dog's neck and whispered, "Not yet." That afternoon, while Jane was on a video call for work, she received a voicemail from a restricted number. The voice was tight, overpronounced, and falsely polite. "Ms. Winslow, we've been informed of repeated disturbances emanating from your property at inappropriate hours. Please review your city's noise regulations regarding animal control and nighttime limitations. This is not the first concern." No name, no department, just veiled accusation through a disposable channel. Jane saved the message and continued working, her face expressionless, even as her hand tightened around her pen. That night, she changed the clip. Not drastically, just enough. She extended it by 8 seconds, added a high-pitched yelp near the end, then dropped the overall volume by 10% to test range tolerances. The speaker performed flawlessly again. 2 nights later, she spotted movement. A light flicked on across the way, and through the narrow slats of her blinds she glimpsed Karen standing at her back window, rigid, her arm raised as if holding something, maybe a phone. Jane said nothing. She knew exactly what would happen next. By the weekend, Jane had received her first formal citation, folded neatly inside an envelope marked "Urgent." It bore a basic city seal and a timestamp. It accused her of harboring a disruptive animal, named the 2 a.m. disturbances specifically, and noted that further violations could result in fines. Jane scanned the document carefully, then highlighted the clause about verified resident complaint with supporting documentation. She didn't need to guess who had submitted it. What interested her was the phrase supporting documentation. Audio. Video. Karen had submitted something tangible, or claimed to. Jane requested a copy through formal response. Her inquiry was noted, pending. Meanwhile, she returned to her speaker, wiped the card clean, and let it rest. A lull followed. Jane waited. No more knocks, no letters, no calls. For 5 days, she heard nothing, until she noticed a small black device zip-tied to the telephone pole across from her backyard. It wasn't official equipment. She could tell by the way it was mounted. No utility tags, no identification, no protective housing. Just a cheap weather-resistant mic, angled toward her yard, pointed specifically at Luna's run area. She took a photo, emailed it to the city, and asked whether any department had authorized audio monitoring on residential property. No one had. A week later, the device disappeared. The silence didn't last. That Sunday morning, Jane woke to find her recycling bin overturned in the middle of her driveway, paper and plastic scattered neatly, not like it had tipped, but like it had been poured out. No signs of wind or animals. No footprints. She swept it up slowly, Luna sitting alert by her side. Jane noticed a new object shoved beneath the bin. A laminated copy of a printout from a local animal control site with a section highlighted in red marker. Chronic barking is grounds for removal. Jane folded the paper in half and burned it in her kitchen sink without a word. She began to notice the patterns. Karen, walking along the sidewalk with her phone held conspicuously at chest height, slow and deliberate steps as she passed Jane's yard, a neighbor she'd never spoken to before waving stiffly and saying, "Hope, everything's all right over there," in a tone that said the opposite, a whisper of rumors, the kind that didn't reach you directly but shaped how people moved around you, how long they held eye contact. Jane felt it all, the shift in energy, the atmosphere turning sour. Still, she didn't react. Instead, she documented. She kept a file, dates, times, screenshots, photos. Not for revenge, but for record. If the city questioned her again, she'd have more than her word. She also started keeping Luna indoors more often, not out of guilt, but caution. It wasn't about noise anymore. It never had been. It was about narrative control, about framing Jane as unstable, difficult, antagonistic. Karen was building a case against her not in court but in perception, weaving a story where Jane was the loud one, the aggressive one, the outsider with a dog she couldn't manage. And then, one night, Jane heard it. Barking, but not from Luna. Luna was asleep next to her on the couch. This barking came from outside, from the corner of the yard near the tool shed. She stood, slowly, opened the door just a crack, and listened. The sound repeated. 2 sharp barks, a pause, then a yelp. Familiar. 2 familiar. It was her own edited file, the one she had created weeks ago. Someone was playing it back. Jane stepped outside barefoot, crossed the lawn to the corner of the fence, and found a small Bluetooth speaker lodged beneath the hydrangeas. No labels, no markings. Still warm to the touch. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen with a notepad and a cup of black coffee, her face pale, the quiet rage inside her bubbling up like lava beneath the skin. This wasn't miscommunication. This wasn't neighborly tension. This was manipulation. Active, deliberate, calculated. Karen wasn't reacting to a noisy dog. She was creating noise, framing it, then blaming Jane for it. The next morning, Jane filed a formal complaint with the city. Not about barking. About harassment. She included photos, timestamps, recordings. She stopped speaking in theory and began describing patterns of escalation, targeted interference, psychological pressure. Her tone was measured, devoid of emotion, yet decisive. She didn't accuse, she laid out evidence. And then, with remarkable calm, she reactivated the speaker at 2 a.m. But this time, instead of barking, she played a recording of her own voice, barely audible, reciting municipal noise ordinances verbatim in a steady, neutral tone. 30 seconds. Then, silence. Then, sleep. It was no longer a game. By the time the third week of silence settled in, Jane had grown so used to bracing for the next move that peace itself felt suspect. The absence of noise, of notes, knocks, or distant barks was no longer comforting. It was anticipatory, like the breath held just before an earthquake. She woke each morning scanning her porch for envelopes, eyed the street for signs of Karen's car, and monitored Luna's behavior for any signs of agitation. The speaker had been removed from under the hydrangeas, and Jane kept it locked in a drawer now, its battery drained, as though it were a cursed object better stored out of sight. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not just observed, but studied, measured. That paranoia proved warranted one morning when Jane stepped outside to water the rosemary near the fence and found an orange inspection tag zip-tied to her back gate. The notice, stamped with the logo of the city's Residential Enforcement Division, listed "Unresolved Noise Complaints Under Investigation" as the cause of inspection. It was dated 3 days earlier. No one had knocked, no one had left a card or called, just this silent, fluorescent plastic warning dangling like a badge of shame. She read it twice, heart pounding. It wasn't a fine, not yet, but it was the first bureaucratic breadcrumb. It meant a case number had been opened. Inside, Jane called the city and spoke to a representative, a woman with a clipped tone who seemed mildly irritated to be asked for clarification. The notice, the woman explained, had been posted in response to a series of audio-substantiated complaints. When Jane asked who had submitted them, she was told that the complainant's identity was protected under community privacy protocols. However, the woman added, it's not uncommon for a file to contain recordings, logs, even resident statements, particularly if there's a history. History. That was the word that stuck in Jane's mind long after she ended the call. Not evidence. Not merit. Just history. A chain of one-sided documentation, initiated by someone who knew exactly how to build a profile. The same profile Jane now had to dismantle piece by piece from the inside out. That night, she didn't sleep. Not from anxiety, but from calculation. She sat at her desk, surrounded by pages, copies of every letter she'd received, audio logs from her own recorder, screenshots of timestamps showing when Luna was indoors, and records of every interaction with city offices. She laid them out like a prosecutor preparing a deposition. This wasn't just about defending her right to live quietly, it was about proving that the accusations themselves were a form of harassment, and if she didn't find a way to flip the narrative soon, it wouldn't matter whether Luna barked or not. The image had already been painted. The next day, she contacted an attorney, not a high-profile litigator, just a civil claims specialist with experience in neighborhood disputes. She met him in a neutral office downtown, the kind of place tucked between insurance brokers and dental practices, where the walls were beige and the water cooler always hissed slightly louder than the conversation. His name was Michael Cross, a man in his late 40s who looked like he spent most of his weekends rebuilding motorcycles. He wore a flannel shirt, not a suit, and listened more than he spoke. She laid out her evidence and timeline. He took notes without interruption, then leaned back and folded his arms. "You're being targeted," he said plainly, "not because of what you've done, but because you didn't fold when someone expected you to. This kind of thing happens more than people think, but it rarely gets documented as clearly as you've done." Jane raised her eyebrows. "So, what do I do now?" He smiled slightly, not smug, just experienced. "Now, you don't defend. You counter. We request a formal review of the complaint record, force them to disclose their audio files, and request a neutral third-party mediation. And while that's processing, I'll file a notice with the city clerk alleging retaliatory action. You're not retaliating. You're responding. That distinction matters." Jane left the office with a lightness in her step she hadn't felt in weeks. She wasn't just surviving this anymore. She was starting to reclaim the frame of the story. But the calm didn't last long. A few days later, on a Wednesday just before sunset, Jane was walking Luna around the block when she saw Karen speaking to a man in a city maintenance vest just outside her driveway. The man carried a clipboard and appeared to be nodding as Karen gestured toward Jane's house, her hands moving with exaggerated precision. Jane didn't stop, but she caught enough of the conversation as she passed. It's the nightly noise, every week like clockwork, and now she's making recordings, some kind of psychological game. The man didn't look hostile, just tired, the kind of official used to neighbors spinning tales about tree roots and trash bins and whose hydrangeas were too aggressive. But still, he wrote something down. Jane went straight home, locked the door, and updated her log. 2 days later, a new complaint arrived, this time from Animal Control. It stated that an anonymous tip had suggested Luna was being confined for extended periods without adequate exercise or socialization. The phrasing was almost laughable in its obviousness. Jane immediately printed Luna's vet records, GPS exercise data from her collar tracker, and a spreadsheet of their daily walks logged via her phone. She faxed the entire package to the contact number listed on the form and followed up by phone. The woman she spoke to sounded bored and apologized for the inconvenience. "It's clear this doesn't apply to you," she said. "We'll mark the case inactive." But Jane was beginning to feel the toll, not just in her nerves, but in her body. Sleep became sporadic, fragmented by dreams of barking that weren't real and footsteps that weren't there. Luna grew clingier, sensing something invisible just beneath the surface of their lives. Jane stopped drinking coffee after 3 p.m., started carrying pepper spray on their evening walks, and scanned bushes for anything that didn't belong. She changed the password on her Wi-Fi. She closed the blinds. Then came the final straw. One morning, Luna didn't come when called. Jane searched the house, the yard, called her name in every corner. Panic gripped her chest like a clamp. She was about to call the police when she heard a faint whimper from the alleyway behind her house. She rushed outside, still barefoot, and found Luna curled in the far corner of the fence, shaking. A section of the rear gate had been tampered with. Loose screws, the latch bent inward as though someone had tried to pull it open. Jane scooped Luna into her arms and checked her body. No injuries, no cuts. But the dog was clearly terrified. That night, Jane installed motion-activated floodlights around the property perimeter and posted a notice on the community forum asking if anyone had witnessed suspicious activity. Predictably, no one responded. But 2 days later, she found a typed note in her mailbox that read, "Maybe some animals just don't belong in quiet neighborhoods." No signature. Jane brought the note directly to Michael. This was no longer just neighborhood friction. This was intimidation. He reviewed the note, the photos of the gate, and Luna's behavior. "We've crossed into malicious territory," he said. "This isn't about noise complaints anymore. This is about harassment. And now you're going to make them own it." He drafted a letter, citing municipal code violations for harassment, unauthorized surveillance, false reports, and emotional distress. It was submitted to the city clerk's office and copied to the neighborhood council. The letter wasn't accusatory. It was evidentiary. It laid out a timeline, documented escalation, and requested an investigation. He also advised Jane to file a police report, not for the note, but for the gate. It was an attempted intrusion, possibly criminal mischief. It needed to be on record. When the officer arrived, Jane was calm. She didn't accuse anyone by name. She simply presented the evidence, described the pattern, and asked for a case file to be opened. The officer took notes and said he'd forward it to the precinct's property crimes unit. After he left, Jane sat in the living room beside Luna and watched the sun dip below the rooftops. She didn't feel victorious. She felt exhausted. But she also felt something else. Finally, after weeks of maneuvering and defending and documenting, she felt seen. The letter from the city clerk's office arrived in a plain, white envelope, marked only with Jane's name and address, its ordinary appearance belittling the weight of what it represented. Inside was an acknowledgement of receipt for the complaint Michael had submitted, confirming that the matter was now under preliminary review. There was no promise of action, no suggestion of urgency, just a paragraph outlining that the documents had been filed, a case number assigned, and that all relevant parties will be notified should the inquiry proceed to formal mediation. It was procedural language, cold and neutral, but to Jane it was a turning point. For the first time since the start of this calculated campaign, her account of events had been entered into the official record. No longer was she simply the subject of complaints, She was now a complainant in her own right, with names, dates, audio logs, photographs, and even the tampered fence latch forming the spine of a counter-narrative that couldn't be so easily erased or dismissed. Michael's advice had been simple. Stay quiet, stay precise, and do nothing that could be perceived as reactive. People like this, he had said during their last meeting, they thrive on escalation. They want you to lash out so they can point and say, "See? I told you she was unstable." Jane had taken that advice to heart. She had returned to routine, not to normal because there was no normal now, but to structure. She walked Luna at different hours, never the same route twice, and kept a digital voice recorder clipped to her jacket pocket at all times. At night, she set motion-activated alerts to her phone and kept a copy of every incident log on both a hard drive and a cloud backup. It wasn't paranoia, it was insurance. But the silence that followed the submission of her formal complaint wasn't comforting. It felt strategic. Karen had disappeared from her usual routine. No more long walks with her phone aimed at Jane's fence, no clipped greetings shouted from the property line, no more pamphlets slipped into Jane's mailbox. In her place was stillness. Lights off early. Blinds drawn. A vacuum where hostility once lived. Jane couldn't decide if it was retreat or recalibration. Then, on a cool Thursday morning as Jane returned from a short grocery run, she found a bright green notice taped to her front window. It was from zoning enforcement, citing her for non-permitted exterior surveillance devices in a residential area, referencing the small security camera she had mounted to monitor the rear fence after the incident with Luna. The complaint had been filed just 3 days earlier. Anonymous, of course, but it named the camera's location in exact detail, as though someone had measured it from their own property line. Jane's hands trembled only slightly as she peeled the notice down and placed it with the others. She scanned the street. Karen's car was gone. That evening, Jane attended her first open community board meeting. She didn't speak. She sat in the back, silent, listening, watching the faces of neighbors she barely knew discuss road repairs, water pressure inconsistencies, and the spring landscaping schedule. She looked for signs of sympathy, of collusion, of awareness, anything that would give her a sense of who among them knew what was happening behind hedges and closed blinds. No one looked her way. But at the very end of the meeting, as people rose to leave, one woman paused beside Jane and muttered under her breath, "You're not the first one she's done this to." Then she walked out without looking back. The weight of that whisper stayed with Jane all night. It wasn't just about her. Karen had a pattern. That meant there might be others. She considered knocking on doors, asking around, but that would risk misinterpretation. So instead, Jane went online. She didn't search for Karen's name. Too little was likely to surface. But she did search the property records, and in doing so found that Karen's name had appeared on 3 separate addresses within the past 10 years, all within similarly managed suburban zones. Each had associations, bylaws, complaint channels. 2 of the addresses were linked to prior filings related to neighborhood disputes. Nothing criminal, nothing explosive, but enough to form a shape. At Michael's suggestion, Jane composed a letter addressed not to Karen, but to the board. It was polite, restrained, and carefully crafted. It explained her concerns, requested clarification about recent enforcement actions, and asked for transparency regarding the complaint system, specifically whether unverified complaints could be used as justification for citations or property flagging. She didn't name Karen. She didn't need to. The implication was embedded in the precision of her language. She sent it through registered mail. That weekend, Jane noticed a new detail outside Karen's home. A small white sign planted near the sidewalk, reading, "Neighborhood Quiet Zone. Please respect all hours." It wasn't official. It had no city backing. It was just another projection of control. Jane said nothing. She didn't need to. 2 days later, the sign was gone. Then came the email. Not from Karen, but from the mediation office handling municipal disputes. The case had been reviewed, and based on the documentation submitted, a formal mediation session was being scheduled. Jane was instructed to attend, and she could bring legal representation. Karen, too, had been notified. The date was set for the following Tuesday. The office was located on the 4th floor of a government annex building that smelled of old carpets and processed air. Jane arrived early, dressed in the same calm professionalism she brought to every audit she'd ever conducted. Pressed blouse, minimal makeup, hair tied back. Michael met her in the lobby, his tone level but firm. "Let her talk," he reminded. "Let her exaggerate. Let her make herself the problem." They entered the room together. Karen was already seated, flanked by a lawyer in a glossy gray suit with the expression of someone who billed by the hour whether he understood the case or not. Karen looked smaller than usual, her blouse too stiff, her posture too rehearsed. She nodded once toward Jane, no smile. The mediator was a woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the calm vocal tempo of a yoga instructor. She explained the procedure, then asked Karen to begin. Karen launched into a list of grievances. Nightly barking, erratic noises, alleged recordings designed to disrupt sleep, and an ongoing environment of passive hostility. Her lawyer handed over a folder of printed timestamps, most of them vague, many of them referencing times when Luna had been confirmed indoors. Jane remained still. When it was her turn, she spoke slowly, clearly. She described the escalation, the surveillance device she had found, the tampered gate, the laminated threats. She provided audio logs, GPS dog walk tracking, and the video showing Luna sleeping during the supposed noise events. She never raised her voice. Michael punctuated key facts with brief summaries. The mediator nodded, took notes, asked for clarifications. By the end of the session, it was clear who had brought evidence and who had brought suspicion. Karen's lawyer asked for an extension. The mediator declined. "The pattern of complaints appears to lack independent verification," she said. "Further action may require legal adjudication, but based on what I've seen today, I advise both parties to cease direct engagement. This matter has reached its natural administrative conclusion." Karen's lips tightened. She gathered her papers and left without a word. Jane didn't feel triumphant. But she felt something else. She had reached the midpoint of this war, and she was still standing. The outcome of the mediation was supposed to be a conclusion, a forced reset between two people clearly incapable of coexistence. At least that's what the city assumed when it closed the file and sent Jane the final documentation confirming the matter had been administratively resolved. But Jane knew better. People like Karen didn't lose quietly. They didn't accept neutrality when they had invested so much time and energy into crafting a narrative of victimhood. Karen hadn't been looking for resolution. She'd been looking for control. And when control is threatened, people like her shift tactics. They retreat not to regroup but to reconceive the battlefield. Jane felt it the very next morning, in the change in the air, in the stillness that wasn't peace but silence before a storm. At first, there was nothing overt. Karen avoided eye contact, remained inside her house, and for almost 2 weeks did not cross the invisible threshold that separated their properties. Jane allowed herself the illusion of calm, used the time to resume parts of her life that had been neglected. She caught up on audits, took Luna to the vet for a long-overdue checkup, and started walking routes outside the neighborhood just to breathe somewhere that didn't feel like a tactical zone. She stopped checking her surveillance footage every night and even began sleeping with her phone outside the bedroom. It felt like healing, until the flyers appeared. It started with one, a half-page leaflet folded and wedged into her mailbox, printed in grainy black and white, featuring a stock photo of a barking dog and the words, "Noise nuisance when a neighbor's pet becomes a community problem." No sender. No contact, just the suggestion of a wider conversation. Jane scanned the flyer, eyes narrowing at the phrasing. It referenced chronic barking, refusal to respond to mediation, and passive-aggressive retaliation. The phrases were clinical but pointed, unmistakably drawn from the allegations Karen had made during the formal process. 2 days later, a second flyer appeared, then a third, this time posted on the community board near the local park as if the issue were a public concern. Someone was trying to shift the narrative not through formal complaints this time, but through public opinion. Jane took the flyers down silently and photographed them. She contacted Michael, who advised that while the flyers weren't directly defamatory by legal standards, they could be considered part of a broader harassment pattern if connected to the previous case. But proving authorship would be difficult unless Karen admitted to posting them or was caught in the act. Jane decided to watch, not react, not retaliate, just document, again. But waiting did not mean passivity. Jane increased her vigilance. She began setting her motion cameras to record not just movement, but sustained loitering. She upgraded her audio sensors to track anomalous sound spikes over time, mapping decibel levels against her routine. She wasn't looking for noise. She was looking for patterns, irregularities, the invisible fingerprints of escalation. She created a map of her property marked with timestamps where disturbances had been detected over the past month, from the incident with the tampered gate to the Bluetooth speaker in the bushes. The data told a story, one of proximity, precision, and intent. Still, for a few more days, nothing new occurred. Jane maintained her boundaries, made no contact, and adjusted her daily rhythms to be less predictable. But then the second escalation arrived, not through paper or words, but through action. Late one Friday evening, Jane returned from the grocery store to find her backyard gate ajar. She knew immediately that it wasn't wind. The latch required deliberate effort to disengage. She stepped through cautiously, every sense alert, and found no one there. Luna remained inside the house, safe, watching from the window with calm eyes. But on the ground, near the gate, was a smear of mud. Not from her yard, where the ground had been dry for days, but fresh, still moist. Someone had entered, not just to scare, but to test. Jane called the non-emergency line and filed another report. The officer arrived within 40 minutes, took her statement, and examined the latch. Nothing damaged, he noted, but we'll add it to your existing file. He offered to increase patrols near her block for the weekend and suggested she invest in motion-triggered lights. Jane nodded, thanked him, and walked him out. But inside she was already reactivating her internal defenses. The flyers had been a whisper. This was a touch. The next would be louder. She wasn't wrong. The following Wednesday, just after midnight, a sharp thud jolted her from sleep. She sprang from bed, grabbed her flashlight and phone, and moved toward the living room. Outside, the backyard lights flicked on, triggered by motion, revealing a toppled trash bin near the back fence. That alone wasn't strange, but painted across her back door in crude red letters was a single word: liar. The paint was fresh, the strokes sloppy but deliberate. It had been done quickly, likely with a spray can, and the perpetrator had already vanished. Jane didn't scream. She didn't panic. She photographed everything, turned off the lights, and waited inside until morning. Then she called the police. This time, the responding officer treated the incident with greater urgency. He called for a second unit, filed an expanded report, and dusted the doorknob and gate for prints. The graffiti was recorded, and a criminal mischief case was opened. Jane handed over her camera footage, though the angle hadn't captured the intruder's face, only a shadowed figure in a hoodie moving with practiced speed. Michael filed a formal injunction request the next day, citing the vandalism as an escalation of the ongoing harassment. He included a dossier of every incident, printout, timestamp, and report since the first letter Jane received. It was a thick packet, methodically structured and designed not to prove malice alone, but to demonstrate a pattern of invasive, obsessive behavior that could no longer be considered coincidence. They didn't name Karen outright. They didn't need to. The timing, the proximity, and the content spoke louder than any accusation. The injunction was granted on a temporary basis, pending a hearing. Jane was instructed to have no direct contact with Karen and vice versa. The hearing was set for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, Jane was told to remain vigilant, to notify law enforcement of any further incidents, and to report violations immediately. Karen, predictably, responded through indirect channels. Jane began receiving emails from unrecognized addresses, messages with vague, unsettling phrasing. "You think you've won, but silence isn't peace." Or, "Dogs bark, but what happens when they bite?" Most were unsigned, routed through dummy accounts. Jane forwarded each one to Michael, who tracked their IP origins. 2 were traced back to public Wi-Fi locations. 1, however, had been sent from a residential server that matched Karen's property address. Michael added it to the file. Luna, through it all, remained steady. Jane worried at times that her own anxiety would bleed into the dog, but Luna seemed to understand the rhythm of the conflict in ways no one else could. She remained calm during sirens, alert during prowling steps beyond the fence, and never barked without reason. It was a strange comfort, the loyalty of a creature unburdened by malice or manipulation. The community, too, began to shift. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now offered tentative nods. One woman even approached Jane during a morning walk and asked quietly, "Is it true what happened to your door?" Jane didn't explain. She simply said, "It was cleaned off." The woman nodded and walked away. By the time the hearing arrived, Jane was tired, but prepared. Michael argued her case with clarity and restraint, citing the cumulative pattern, the escalation, the psychological toll. Karen's defense was disjointed. Her lawyer attempted to redirect the narrative back to noise complaints, but the judge wasn't persuaded. The injunction was extended for 6 months, with a warning that any violation could result in criminal charges. Karen said nothing as she left the courtroom. She didn't look at Jane. She didn't need to. The message had already been delivered weeks ago, painted in red across her door. But now, finally, there was a new message, this time from the law. Enough. The injunction changed everything, but not in the way Jane had hoped. On paper, it was a victory. Clear boundaries drawn by the law, the validation of months of fear, escalation, and restraint. But in practice, it became a spotlight, not on Karen, but on Jane herself. The neighbors who had begun to open up withdrew again, wary of involvement in something they didn't understand. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with something closer to suspicion, as if trying to decide whether the quiet woman with the collie was really the problem after all. Jane didn't blame them. People preferred simple stories, and what had unfolded on their block over the past 3 months was anything but simple. Karen had gone silent. She no longer walked past Jane's house, no longer appeared on her porch with leaflets or manufactured grievances. Her yard grew wilder by the week, flower beds choked with weeds, paint peeling from the trim. It was a visible unraveling, and Jane saw it as both warning and omen. This wasn't over. It was just taking a new shape. Then came the fire. It was small, controlled, extinguished within minutes, but it could have been much worse. Jane had stepped outside early one Saturday to water her potted herbs and immediately noticed the sharp scent of something acrid. She followed it to the side of the house near the outdoor storage bins and saw a thin column of blackened soot rising from the mulch bed. The remnants of a paper bag still smoldered faintly, curled and black, with a burnt but recognizable object inside. A laminated flyer, the same kind that had once appeared in her mailbox. The edges were charred, but she could still make out the words. Chronic noise offenders. Something had been poured on it. Lighter fluid, maybe. The fire hadn't spread thanks to the dampness of the previous night's rain, but it had been deliberate. Not vandalism. A message. She called the fire department and filed a report. When the officer asked if she suspected anyone, she hesitated, then gave Karen's name. She wasn't proud of how it sounded, how accusatory it felt, but this wasn't about feelings anymore. It was about patterns, and this one fit too neatly to be coincidence. The fire was documented, the debris collected for analysis, and the case was linked to her ongoing file. Still, Jane could tell by the officer's tone that unless a camera had caught Karen in the act or fingerprints were recovered, nothing would come of it. She didn't sleep that night, not out of fear, but calculation. Karen had gone from noise complaints to surveillance to trespassing to psychological warfare. The escalation was no longer passive. It was now physical. Jane replayed the events again and again in her mind, searching for the gap, the moment where she might have turned it differently. But the truth was, she had never been in control of the game. She had simply refused to lose it quietly. By Monday, another shift occurred. Jane received a call from her employer's HR department. They had received a complaint, anonymous of course, alleging that Jane was using company resources to conduct personal investigations during work hours. The claim was unfounded, baseless, and ultimately dismissed, but the call itself shook her. Karen wasn't just targeting her home anymore. She was reaching into the one place Jane had always kept clean, protected, separate. The sanctity of her job. The timing was no accident. The file had been sent days after the fire report, just when Jane had regained some sense of control. Karen had taken note of the shift, and retaliated. Michael was furious when she told him. He filed a supplemental complaint with the court, attaching the HR letter and a sworn affidavit from Jane's manager affirming her professional conduct. But the real damage wasn't legal. It was psychological. Karen had found a new front, and she had pierced it perfectly. Jane doubled down. She re-upped her security system, added thermal cameras, reinforced her side gates, and upgraded the locks. She began keeping a secondary phone in the house, backup documentation off-site, and a set of photos and files ready to send at the touch of a button. She wasn't paranoid. She was precise. She didn't walk Luna without a flashlight and a visible GoPro clipped to her shoulder strap. If they were watching her, she'd make damn sure they knew she was watching back. Then came the final crack. It was 3:21 a.m. when she heard the crash, not from outside, but from inside the house. She shot upright, disoriented for half a second before Luna barked sharply from the hallway. Jane grabbed the flashlight, heart pounding, and crept forward, every instinct on fire. In the kitchen, one of the window panes had shattered inward. Glass scattered across the counter, the curtain torn. She dropped to the ground and crawled toward the back door, peering outside. A figure was running. Dark hoodie, light shoes, fast and agile, disappearing into the night. She didn't chase. She called 911. The police arrived quickly. They canvassed the area, found no sign of the intruder, but noted the pattern. This was not random. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was touched. It was a demonstration. The break-in wasn't about theft or entry. It was about violation. About standing on sacred ground and shattering it with intention. The report was filed. The window boarded up. Jane didn't cry. She sat on the floor with Luna curled at her side and stared at the broken pane for over an hour. Then she stood, picked up her phone, and called Michael. "We need a restraining order," she said simply. "Full, immediate, permanent." The paperwork moved quickly this time. The judge, already familiar with the ongoing case, issued a full protective order within 48 hours. Karen was served on a Thursday afternoon. Jane didn't witness it, but a neighbor reported seeing Karen standing on her porch, jaw clenched, arms crossed as the officer explained the document. She said nothing. She took the paper and went inside. 2 days later, Karen's house went dark. No lights, no movement, no sound. And then the rumors began. Someone had seen a moving truck. Someone else said Karen was staying with relatives. Another swore she had been seen at a storage unit near the edge of town. But no one had spoken to her. No one knew for certain. And for the first time in months, Jane walked through her yard without glancing over the fence. She walked Luna in the open, without rerouting or hiding. She slept through the night with her phone on silent. She left the curtain open. The silence felt different now. Not empty, but clean. No longer the absence of threat, but the presence of choice. She had endured the escalation, and she had not broken. The first morning Jane stepped outside without tension gripping her spine. The sun felt sharper, heavier on her skin, like she was experiencing weather again instead of surviving beneath it. It had been 9 days since the restraining order was served, and 6 since Karen's house had gone dark. In that time, no mail had arrived in Jane's box bearing veiled threats, no flyers had been posted, no anonymous emails slid into her inbox. The cameras recorded nothing but the natural rhythm of her block: birds, delivery vans, a squirrel that liked to taunt Luna from the top of the fence. It was, in every visible sense, peace. But Jane wasn't foolish enough to romanticize the stillness. She understood that peace wasn't something you won like a prize. It was something you protected, every day, with deliberate effort, like sleep after trauma or trust after betrayal. Karen's absence was never confirmed, but the house remained empty. The blinds stayed drawn, and the porch light never came on, not even at dusk. A neighbor mentioned she'd seen someone taking bags to a car late at night. Another claimed to have heard shouting through the walls days before the break-in, but Jane didn't ask questions. It didn't matter anymore where Karen had gone or why. What mattered was that the siege had ended, and that Jane had survived it intact, but not unchanged. There was a moment, about a week after the final incident, when Jane realized she'd been holding her breath for months. She was standing in the hallway, brushing her hand along the doorframe of her guest bedroom, and she caught sight of herself in the mirror. Not just tired, transformed. Her face was leaner, her gaze more focused. The passivity that had once shaped her life, the instinct to accommodate, to minimize her presence for the sake of others' comfort, it was gone. She had learned something visceral about herself through the ordeal, not just how to endure, but how to respond without becoming the very thing that tried to break her. Her routines slowly shifted back toward normalcy, though not the old kind. She deleted the decoy sound files from her computer, dismantled the speaker system, and replaced the back door's shattered pane with reinforced glass. The motion cameras stayed, not out of paranoia, but out of choice. She'd earned the right to watch her perimeter. She began gardening again, replanting herbs and low succulents along the fence, a gesture of reclamation as much as aesthetics. Luna seemed lighter, too, her energy calmer, her playfulness returning, as if the fog had lifted from her world as well. Jane received a letter from the court 2 weeks later confirming that the protective order had been accepted without appeal. Karen had not contested it. There would be no hearing, no statements, no attempt to rewrite the story. The silence, finally, was conclusive. For a while, Jane considered moving, selling the house, relocating to a quieter, more anonymous place where the soil wasn't soaked with memory. But something about the idea made her feel as if she'd be giving away what she'd fought so hard to protect. This house was hers, not just legally, but spiritually. Every camera she'd installed, every report she'd filed, every sleepless night and boundary she'd enforced had been an act of ownership, not just over the property, but over her right to exist within it unharassed. And she wasn't about to give that up because someone else couldn't accept her autonomy. So she stayed. And slowly the neighborhood noticed. Not everyone approached her, not all at once. But there were nods again. Small gestures. Someone brought over cookies in a quiet act of acknowledgement. Another neighbor offered to help trim a tree limb that had begun leaning over her garage. They didn't talk about what had happened. They didn't have to. People knew. People remembered. And, most importantly, people had seen how she handled it. With clarity, with restraint, with backbone. On the 1-month mark, Jane did something she hadn't done since moving in. She invited a colleague from work over for lunch. They sat on the back deck, shaded by the rebuilt awning, sipping iced tea while Luna lounged at their feet. The colleague complimented the yard, mentioned how peaceful it was, how clean and quiet. Jane smiled, nodded, and said only, "It took some work." That night, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and shadows stretched across the lawn, Jane stood at the edge of her property and looked toward the vacant house next